So, if you want to know the best decks for climbing to whatever rank you want to get to at the start of this next season, sit tight because I'm going to give you the 5 best decks and then also like 2 personal preference decks I think will be good but might not necessarily be super high on the tier list themselves. So, first one is Rush Warrior. I think Rush Warrior is probably the strongest deck in the game right now. I think it is even stronger than Paladin, which I know some people might disagree with me on, but if you learn how to play this deck, the amount of value you can get is insane. And as soon as you hit that turn 5 with conditioning, and then use Bumper Car, and then have, some of the 1/1s, then play conditioning, summon a ton of 3/3 rushes for 1 mana, you can kind of just shut down Paladins. You do okay versus Hunter, because obviously you're Warrior, you can hero power a couple of times on slow turns and gain some HP, so you have pretty good matchups into 2 of the strongest classes in the game, and you also have enough tempo to beat the control matchups like Warlock and Priest if they don't have removal on demand, So overall, I think that this class and this deck is really, really strong. But this is not the only deck if you want to do one that's a little bit cheaper, because this one does have a couple of legendaries. If you guys like the content, feel free to hit the like button down below. It really helps me out with the algorithm. And if you have any questions about the deck or you want me to play another deck, leave that in the comments. I'd be happy to look at them. And then also, if you want to see more content like this where I play some of the best decks in the game, give you pretty high level gameplay, and also play some meme decks for your enjoyment sometimes, come back for more, hit the subscribe button, and I hope to see you there. Let's jump into the video. Next one is Face Hunter, obviously. Face Hunter and Paladin I'd put at pretty much the exact same level. They're both just play minions on the board, slam face, do as much damage as you can, but I do think that Face Hunter is a little bit better because at the end of the game, if the opponent stabilizes the board, which does happen with most control decks around turn like 6 or 7-ish, this deck has direct damage with your hero power and quick shot and knife benders and even trampling Rhino in order to finish off your opponent. Whereas Paladin doesn't have that. It has weapons and stuff, so if your opponent puts up a taunt or something, you can come up just short of damage. So it comes down to personal preference. I feel like I'm just more comfortable with Face Hunter, but both play pretty similarly. Very aggressive decks that rely on early damage and then finishing them off late with either A, big pump spells and minions for Paladin, or B, like in this case, direct damage spells and the trampling Rhino. Next we have Paladin, and obviously there are a couple of different ways you could play this deck. This one is not the only way to play it. You could run one with Moonfang, so that way you can pump it up and have it be an almost unkillable minion. Unless you're playing against like Priest and they Shadow Word Death it, in which case that sucks. Yeah, you could play with that. You could play it with Blademaster Samuro. I've seen some builds use that. You can use Talon as well to guaranteed draw AAECAZICAA instead of running the red scale Dragon Tamer. But I think that this build is slightly more aggressive, and the extra aggro is what this deck is trying to do. This deck really wants to apply as much pressure as possible early, pump up, turn 5, play Conviction, slam them for 6 extra damage, and try to finish them off with good weapons like the Angling Rod or the Hammer, or direct damage with AAECAZICAA. That's generally the game plan of the deck, very similar to Face Hunter, and because of that, I think having a slightly more aggressive build that doesn't rely on Samuro for board wipe because there's really no need, or Talon because he's a little bit more expensive. I just think having the little bit of extra tempo with the Murg and McGurgle and the red scale Dragon Tamer is better. Also, Murg and McGurgle does give you another late game play, so it's not even like you lose late game by playing it. So overall, it's my own personal preference, but it's up to you. Now, if you're on a mega budget, Token Druid is an absolutely phenomenal deck. You're able to build giant boards really, really suddenly, especially if you have a Gibberling. Like, even against a Paladin, right? If you have a Gibberling in your hand with a couple of cheap spells and maybe an Innervate or a Lightning Bloom, you flood the board turn 1 or 2, there's nothing the Paladin can do. Once Paladin loses board control, they lose the game. So, this deck does well into Paladin and even Hunter because in good situations, it can out-aggro those decks. And also, if you want to like Lightning Bloom out a Glowfly Swarm relatively early or Innervate it out turn 4 for a huge board swing, that's also extremely good. The only problem with the deck is the fact that if you don't get Gibberling or Glowfly Swarm, it kind of comes up short. So it's a little bit less consistent than the other decks, but it requires no legendaries. It's really, really strong and has like the 6th highest win rate in the game, even in Legend, because first of all, nobody expects it, and 2, if you hard mulligan for Gibberling, Glowfly Swarm, and like some cheap spells, you're very likely to get the combo off relatively consistently. So because of the fact that you can kind of control your opening hand, and it's very aggressive and people don't expect it, this deck is actually really, really good. Also, people usually expect Ramp Druid, so they keep maybe a different hand than they should, and then you overwhelm them with token, and it's kind of just a win-win. So the next deck on this list is No Minion Mage. No Minion Mage is, albeit a little bit weaker than some of the decks on this list, but really good for a couple of reasons. One, it is relatively cheap. It requires no legendary, so it's in the same position as Token Druid, although it does require some epics and stuff, so it can be a little bit more expensive. But it does a lot of damage. It's actually pretty good at dealing with some of the more aggressive decks in the meta, other than Face Hunter, which has a ton of direct damage. If you're playing against like a Paladin or a Rogue, you can randomly discover ice barriers to keep you alive. You can shooting stars and devolving missiles to kill off and brain freeze, obviously, to kill off or remove the buffs of early game minions. And then you have a ton of damage to finish them off with late game. And then this deck also does better into control decks than the other aggro decks, because control decks are good at slowly building up armor or health, because they can deal with your minions consistently over the course of the game, right? Like Priest is going to consistently remove your board while healing up, and you're going to run out of resources. But no, Minion Mage doesn't put minions on the board. So also Warrior can't Rancor, you can't Devouring Plague with Priest to gain some HP, and then all of a sudden you burst them in over the course of like 3 or so turns, and then it's usually enough damage to kill them, which is really, really good. Also, overall, Devolving Missile is just an amazing card into a lot of matchups, and this card alone makes this deck actually pretty decent. I think Control Warrior is in the position to make a comeback, and now we're getting to the personal preference decks, and these are just going to be 2 or 3 of them, but I think Control Warrior is going to be really good. Usually at the beginning of the season, most people play aggressive decks, so if you want a high win rate and you want to win most of your games, Control Warlock or Control Priest is probably the way to go. This deck does do better against No Minion Mage than Priest does, because Priest, like I said, tries to heal over the course of the game, but Warrior can build up armor, so it can technically overheal, which can be really, really, really helpful into a deck that tries to burst you, like Mage. On top of that, you also have the fact that it just gains a lot of armor and has good removal, so it's able to deal with other aggro decks. A good Brawl can basically shut down a Paladin out of nowhere, and they'll never expect it. And then you have a really good late game with AAECAZICAA, Rattlegore, and Cthulhu, which can beat more control matchups. You do struggle against Warlock, I will admit, but other than that, this deck is pretty solid, especially considering you can push some damage with decent minions. The Outrider's Axe, and if you're playing into Priest, you'll probably win in Fatigue too, because you don't draw as many cards and you gain a ton of armor. Control Priest is the second to last deck on this list, and I just think it's really good because, again, it does well into Paladin and Hunter. It doesn't do as well into Mage because they can burst you down, but overall this deck is quite solid. I would say that if you want to play a deck, this is a great one to pick up. The biggest issue with this deck and the Warrior deck is the fact that they're both really expensive, which is why I wouldn't recommend them for climbing, especially if you're a new or even like moderately new player. Like, unless you're really experienced and have a collection, this deck is probably not for you, which sucks. And I hate to say that, but it is probably the most expensive deck on this list. And yeah, it also takes a lot of skill to play because you need to manage your health, know when to heal, when to not heal, when to commit to some board wipe. You have one silence in here that you need to try to use to the best of your ability. Mind Render or Lucia can be played well, but sometimes can just be used very poorly and lose you games. And there's a lot of learning curve to this deck. It loses to Warlock as well because they just burn your Cthulhu, and that is about it. The last deck on this list is a Miracle or Secret Rogue, whatever you want to call it. And I just think it's on this list because it's pretty strong. I don't think it's as strong as some of the other classes, but if you really learn how to play this deck, if you can get really good, if you can think really quickly rather, draw tons of cards with field contact, figure out what to do really quickly, you can actually perform better with this deck than I think you can with most other decks. I think that this is probably one of the highest skill ceilings of any deck currently in the meta, because there are a ton of decisions you have to make. You have to make them very quickly. Your damage is finite, but there is a lot of burst, so a lot of the times it can just be enough that way. Same thing with Mage, right? You burst them down, they don't know that it's coming, and then you win. So I think that this deck has a lot of potential. I would recommend trying it out if you haven't already. It's definitely a fun deck. It's probably the most fun deck, or one of, on this list, because there's so much going on. So if you want something like that, this is the deck for you. If you don't, feel free to try out any of the other decks. If Dust is a problem, no Minion Mage and Token Druid are the best for you, and you can basically pick whatever you want based on your own personal preference. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. If I missed anything, please put in the comments a deck that you think could potentially be good so other people can maybe use it. If you have any questions in general, comment. Liking helps the algorithm a ton, and I'll see you guys in the next one.